Hello everyone, my name is Lan Da Silva, and today we're going to be talking about the 1941 Battle of Kiev. The Battle of Kiev was the most significant German victory, as well as the most catastrophic Soviet defeat in the entire Eastern Front in World War II. The Germans carried out the largest military encirclement in human history, which resulted in the capture of over 600,000 Soviet soldiers by the time that the battle had ended. Today, we're going to be talking about how the Germans carried out this massive encirclement, as well as the context, significance, events, and aftermath of this massive battle. On the 22nd of June, 1941, the Germans launched Operation Barbarossa, which is the largest military invasion in human history against the Soviet Union. 3.8 million Axis soldiers, most of them German, invaded Russia, and the Red Army was caught completely off guard and by surprise. The Soviets did not think the Germans would invade them this early. The Germans inflicted catastrophic defeats on the Red Army. They used encirclement techniques to capture hundreds of thousands of Soviet soldiers during the battles of Smolensk and Minsk. These encirclement techniques would later be used in the Battle of Kiev. In July and August of 1941, Hitler shifted focus to conquering Ukraine, because Ukraine was home to many natural resources which would be vital to securing Lebensraum. And Lebensraum is basically an expansionist belief within National Socialism. However, many of Hitler's generals wanted to continue the advance towards Moscow. This set the stage for the Battle of Kiev, because Hitler had to take the capital of Ukraine, which was Kiev, in order to eventually conquer the whole region. Fighting in Kiev began on the 7th of July, 1941, and around a month later, on August 15th, 1941, the Germans defeated the Soviet troops at Uman, which is a city close to Kiev. They used an encirclement technique in order to trap over 100,000 Soviet troops and then capture them. In order to carry out these massive encirclements of Soviet troops that we saw at Minsk, Smolensk, and later at Kiev, the Germans used the Doppelzangenbewegung military tactic, which translates to the double pincer movement in English. Basically, what the Germans would do is that they would attack the enemy from both sides, and then they would meet up behind them, which would cut off any retreat or supply lines that the Soviets could use to escape the encirclement. This Doppelzangenbewegung tactic is what allowed the Germans to then encircle over 450,000 Soviet troops at Kiev. Mikhail Kirponos, who was the commander of the Southwestern Front in the Battle of Kiev, feared that he and his men would be encircled by the Germans, and therefore he asked Stalin if he could have permission to retreat. However, Stalin rejected the retreat request, and this ended up resulting in the catastrophe for the Soviets that we would later see. Despite the worsening situation and the Soviet defeat at Uman, Kirponos still believed that he could stop the German encirclement of Kiev. In fact, in late August and even up until early September of 1941, the Soviets actually made some successful counterattacks against the Germans, which resulted in the German encirclement stalling. Even though the Soviets fought tooth and nail during the Battle of Kiev, the Germans were able to break through the Soviet lines using Panzer III and Panzer IV tanks. Furthermore, the Germans had air support, and they dive-bombed Soviet positions with Messerschmitt 109 planes. In late August, Panzer Group II, which was moving southwest, crossed the Dnieper River, while Panzer Group I was moving northwards. The two panzer groups met up with each other on the 16th of September, and by then, all hope was lost for the Soviets. After it became clear that the Soviets were facing a potential military catastrophe, Soviet High Command finally allowed Kapernos and his men to retreat. The only problem was the Germans had cut off all of the retreat lines out of the city. Therefore, the Soviet troops were stuck in Kiev. The Germans captured the center of Kiev on the 19th of September, and fighting continued up until the 26th of September, when the last Soviet troops surrendered to the Germans. This marked the end of the Battle of Kiev. During the Battle of Kiev, the Soviets suffered somewhere between 700,000 and 1,000,000 military casualties, of which around 500,000 to 665,000 of those casualties were Soviet troops captured by the Germans. This meant the Germans captured over 500,000 Soviet troops during the military encirclement, of which many of them were sent to concentration camps or subjected to forced labor. On the other side, the Germans suffered only around 130,000 casualties, of which only 26,000 of those casualties were deaths. The German military victory at Kiev resulted in a 200-mile gap being torn open in the Soviet lines in Ukraine. This meant that all of Ukraine was now open to being conquered by the Germans. After the catastrophic military defeat for the Soviets, Joseph Stalin immediately attempted to shift blame onto military general Semyon Budini. And today, most historians agree that the decision to not allow Soviet armies at the Battle of Kiev to retreat, which is the decision Stalin made, was the reason that this military disaster happened. On the flip side, the victory at Kiev was celebrated in Germany. Adolf Hitler referred to the battle as, unquote, the biggest battle in the history of the world. Furthermore, Joseph Goebbels referred to the victory at Kiev as the greatest battle of annihilation of all time. According to some historians, the Battle of Kiev was not only the largest single German victory on the Eastern Front, but it was actually the largest single German victory in the entire war. However, despite this, as you would know, the victory of Kiev did not result in Germany winning the war, as they were defeated by the Soviet Union in 1945. However, in conclusion, the Battle of Kiev was still the largest military encirclement in history, and it was one of the most significant Soviet defeats during World War II. In fact, many would argue the biggest Soviet defeat in World War II. Thank you so much for listening to this presentation. My name is Landon Da Silva.